Hi, it's Michelle from Muffin Beauty Science, Chemistry PhD and Skincare Nerd. Today we're talking about alcohol. Not drinking alcohol, alcohol in skincare. I knew that. Alcohol is one of the most controversial ingredients in skincare. You'll hear things like alcohol can dry out your skin, give you premature wrinkles, and kill your skin cells. But is this really true? I've been looking at what the research says about this topic with Stephen.
Hi everyone, I'm Stephen from Kind of Stephen. I'm a cosmetic formulator and a friend of Michelle's, and you can find me on Instagram at Kind of Stephen.
Today we're going to be talking about the alcohols in skincare, why they're there, and whether they're worth avoiding. In particular, we're going to be talking about ethyl alcohol or ethanol or denatured alcohol, since this is the main controversial alcohol. If you like this sort of video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and click the notification bell. Let's start by looking at exactly what alcohol is. In chemistry, an alcohol is any carbon-based compound that contains an oxygen bonded to a hydrogen, an OH or hydroxyl group. So, for example, all of these chemicals are alcohols. But just because they're alcohols doesn't mean that they have the same properties on your skin. For example, glycerin and glycols are humectant moisturizers that will hydrate your skin. Sucrose is table sugar. Cetyl alcohol is a fatty alcohol which doesn't evaporate much at all and it feels oily on your skin. For some people it's beneficial as a moisturizer, in other people it breaks them out. So yes, some alcohols can be beneficial for your skin. But when people talk about alcohols in skincare, usually they're referring to the more volatile alcohols, which are the ones that evaporate quickly off your skin. These have a reputation for being drying and irritating, and in particular what they mean is usually ethanol or ethyl alcohol. So what is ethanol? Ethanol, ethyl alcohol or denatured alcohol is mostly the same alcohol that you find in alcoholic drinks.
So I think there's some confusion about what denatured alcohol is. I've read online that it's harsher for your skin, that it's more gentle, that it's another molecule altogether, and that's not the case. So it's still, in this case, ethanol, the same molecule, except there's been different ingredients that have been added in to discourage people from drinking it.
Why is alcohol in skincare products? Ethanol is included in skincare products for a few different reasons. Stephen is a cosmetic formulator who has lots of experience in using different ingredients in skincare products, so he's going to take us through some of these roles.
So ethanol is a really useful solvent. It can dissolve things that normally can dissolve in water, but it can also dissolve things that normally don't dissolve in water. So a lot of fragrances, for example, will come in a ethanol or alcohol base, and that's because the fragrance oils and perfumes that don't normally dissolve in water are able to dissolve in alcohol. Salicylic acid, for example, is an anti-acne ingredient. So it has a very low solubility in water, but it actually dissolves quite readily in ethanol. So a lot of older formulations with salicylic acid, you'll usually see an ethanol component. So ethanol can also be used as a solvent to extract ingredients from plant material, for example, like vanilla extract. It can also be used to remove lipids, oils, and waxes from the skin. If you look at older toner formulations and makeup removers, a lot of them also had ethanol in them to help remove makeup, soil, and dirt. This is a lot less common now, but a high concentration of ethanol can also be used as a preservative in a cosmetic formula. So another property of ethanol is that it's very volatile, which means that it's very fast evaporating. So that gives it a very quick spreading texture and also like a very quick drying, cooling effect on the skin. That's often used in sunscreens to make their texture lighter and help them evaporate and set faster. Ethanol can also be used as a skin penetration enhancer for certain ingredients, and that means it'll help get those ingredients deeper into the skin at a higher concentration than without it. So a lot of formulas are now replacing ethanol with glycols like propanediol or propylene glycol. Propanediol and propylene glycol both have alcohol functional groups on them, that OH group, but they don't have the volatility, the fast evaporation that ethanol does. So they actually remain on the skin and they can give like that glowy, glistening effect on the skin. So that's good for some formulations, but not necessarily all formulations.
I chatted to Susan of Mixed Makeup about some products she uses that have alcohol in them and what it's doing in there. I've put the link to her video in the description. So alcohol is pretty useful for beauty products, but does it have a dark side?
So I generally try to avoid making formulations with ethanol if it can be avoided. That's not necessarily because I think it's dangerous or harmful, just that I know that people in the beauty community really aren't looking for formulations with ethanol anymore.
There are lots of in vitro studies where the effects of alcohol on cells in a dish were studied, and the results of these are pretty scary. Alcohol can make cells die in a process called apoptosis, it can make cells produce inflammatory signals, it can denature proteins, and it can stop enzymes from working. And we know that alcohol is a really good disinfectant. It can kill bacteria very quickly. But skin is very different from naked cells in a dish or a single bacterium made up of just one cell. We have about 10 to 20 layers of dead skin cells on the surface of our skin, the stratum corneum, before we get to the living layers of cells. And these dead cells aren't just any dead cells. They're toughened with keratin, and they're sitting in an oily goop, which is really good at preventing things from entering and leaving. So for ethanol to affect our living skin cells like it does in the in vitro studies, it would firstly have to get through this extremely efficient barrier in a high enough concentration to make a difference. While most of these in vitro studies used relatively low concentrations of ethanol, somewhere around 0.5%, they also left the cells in contact with the ethanol for a really long time, sometimes 24 hours, in a container where the alcohol couldn't evaporate. But ethanol, when we apply it to our skin, is very volatile. It evaporates very easily. And you'll have felt this when you feel the cool sensation from an alcohol-containing product. This is the alcohol evaporating and taking some of your body heat with it. It turns out that when you apply ethanol on your skin, the vast majority of it will evaporate.
So one experiment used pig skin to take a look at how quickly 100% ethanol evaporated off the skin. And what they found was that after 10 seconds, more than 50% of it had already evaporated. Overall, they found that about 3%, less than 3%, was left on the skin. Now, there's some issues with that 3% because they think that some of the alcohol had actually leaked under the chamber of their test equipment. So it's actually likely that it's much less. So what we can infer from this is that if you're using a skincare product with ethanol in the formula, maybe around 5 to 10%, then more than 97% of that is going to evaporate off the skin very quickly.
So all of these studies showing that alcohol was bad for cells in a dish, we can't immediately apply them to the way that we use alcohol in skincare. The most relevant studies for us would be the ones where they looked at alcohol being applied to human skin and observing what happened. As I've mentioned before, it's often really hard to find good skincare studies because most scientific research is funded by the government, so there needs to be a really good public health reason for doing the research. Otherwise, it might be funded by a beauty brand or an ingredient company, in which case there needs to be a strong commercial reason for doing the study. Luckily, there is a relevant situation where people do end up applying lots and lots of alcohol to their skin in much larger quantities and much more often than we would in skincare. That's in healthcare, where alcohol-based hand sanitizers are used by healthcare workers to prevent spreading of diseases. In particular, nurses have to disinfect their hands between patients, and this adds up. One study found that on average, nurses had to clean their hands 55 times a day. Lots of nurses end up with cracked skin, irritation and blisters on their hands from this repeated cleaning. It's been found that skin irritation makes people less likely to follow hand hygiene procedures, and so there's a really compelling public health reason to research this. The main methods for disinfecting hands are washing your hands with soap and water and alcohol-based hand rubs. So there's been quite a few clinical studies comparing soap and water versus alcohol hand rubs and between different hand rub formulas on things like skin irritation, dryness, cracking, and so on. So what do these studies tell us?
What a lot of these studies are showing us is that even using a very large amount of ethanol in the skin doesn't really have a huge long-term impact.
Oh, what? Let's look at one of the more recent detailed studies on alcohol-based hand rubs to get an idea of how these studies are conducted. This article, which I've linked in the description, was published in 2017 in the International Journal of Cosmetic Science. It's open access, so you can download it and read it as well. The clinical part of this study involved testing 3 different alcohols at 70% concentration on the inner forearms of 25 white female volunteers aged 35 to 50. A fourth area of skin had water applied as a comparison. The solutions were rubbed into skin for about 10 seconds, either 20 times a day or 100 times a day. The skin was also washed 6 times a day with hand wash and water to mimic what would happen for a typical nurse. This process was done for 14 days. Around every 2 days, the scientists measured skin hydration, redness, and transepidermal water loss. This is how much water was evaporating through the skin, a way of measuring skin barrier function. So these hand rub studies usually use alcohol concentrations far higher than we would see in skincare, plus they used it many more times a day, plus there's that extra irritation from the repeated cleansing as well. It's likely that whatever effects these studies find will be a bigger version of what would happen to us when we apply a moisturizer or sunscreen with 5 or 10% ethanol in them. So what were the findings of these studies? One of the biggest questions is, does alcohol cause inflammation? Inflammation isn't good for skin. It's been linked to lots of skin issues like acne, rosacea, and premature aging. And in some in vitro cell studies, alcohol does seem to be able to cause cells to release inflammatory markers. But will this happen on actual skin? In these hand rub studies, inflammation was measured by looking at skin redness. Inflammation causes blood flow to increase, and so you get a reddening effect. And in several of these studies, scientists found that ethanol didn't seem to be linked to skin redness compared to no ethanol. This was even the case in a study where 70% ethanol was applied to the skin 100 times a day for 14 days. There was no statistically significant difference in redness compared to water applied 100 times a day. So that is a total of 1,400 applications of ethanol over 2 weeks. Another question about alcohol is whether or not it can disrupt your skin barrier to a harmful extent. Your skin's main job is to act as a barrier between you and the outside world. The top dead layers of skin, the stratum corneum, are essential to this function. To act as an effective barrier, this stratum corneum has to keep itself maintained. The dead skin cells have to continuously shed smoothly, and the oily lipids in between the cells have to stay in an organized formation. On isolated skin samples in vitro, enzymes that are important in cell shedding and in the production of oily lipids can be disturbed, and so they don't work as well. There are also some in vitro studies that suggest that alcohol can temporarily modify how molecules are arranged in your skin, or it can remove lipids from your skin in a process called lipid extraction. This isn't like it's making your skin fall apart or anything, it's much more subtle microscopic changes. For example, how the oily molecules are arranged relative to each other. And this effect doesn't last for long. It's thought that this is how ethanol helps ingredients penetrate your skin. But these findings aren't really consistent. Many times, skin samples, even if they were left with alcohol for a really long time, there weren't big negative effects. And many of these studies do actually point out that the conditions that they use don't reflect how we would use alcohol on our skin. In the clinical studies, ethanol doesn't really seem to disrupt the barrier much. Skin barrier disruption is usually measured through transepidermal water loss. This is how much water is escaping through skin into the air, and so a more disrupted barrier would cause greater water loss. In multiple hand rub studies, changes in transepidermal water loss were minor, even with 20 applications of alcohol a day. There was a measurable difference in one study, but that was when ethanol was applied 100 times a day, much more than we would in skincare, unless you have a very strange skincare routine. One thing that can seem to happen with alcohol is dehydration. There have been mixed results in clinical studies. Some have found that alcohol does decrease hydration while others haven't. For example, in the Kartner study that I mentioned earlier, skin hydration wasn't significantly different between ethanol and water, whether you applied it 20 times a day or 100 times a day. In another study, skin oil content didn't change significantly after applying hand rubs containing 60 to 80% alcohol 50 times a day for a week. However, there are ways to help with dehydration and dryness. One study looked at adding moisturizing ingredients like glycerin and lanolin and fatty alcohols to hand rubs. This study used hand rubs containing propanol, which has been found in other studies to be more irritating than ethanol. They found that these moisturizing ingredients decreased the amount of redness and dryness that the propanol caused. In skincare, propanol is really rare, and we almost always find ethanol combined with these moisturizing ingredients. What about stinging? One reason that we tend to be a bit scared of alcohol is that you sometimes get that painful stinging sensation. But multiple studies have found that that stinging, painful sensation doesn't actually mean that harm is being done to your skin. Alcohol does tend to sting your skin if it's already damaged. The alcohol can go through the skin and touch the nerve endings, which cause the pain. This is like a more sensitive version of what happens when water gets into a paper cut. So what does this mean for alcohol in skincare? These studies on alcohol hand rubs aren't done under the same conditions as we would use alcohol in skincare, but they're a lot closer than in vitro studies. The studies were mostly on arm skin, which is thicker and less sensitive than face skin, plus these studies only lasted a week or two. But they used far higher concentrations of alcohol and many more times than we would use alcohol in a skincare routine. Some of these studies also introduced extra irritation from cleansing many more times than we would in a skincare routine. There's also the fact that in skincare products, we have other ingredients like glycerin, which will reduce the impact of alcohol in terms of dryness or redness or irritation. So overall, the evidence seems to point towards alcohol not being a big deal in skincare, given how small the impact was under the much more extreme conditions in these hand rub studies. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, click the thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and click the notification bell.
And if you have any other topics that you would like us to cover, leave a comment below with your suggestion.
You can also follow us on Instagram and check out our blogs.
And drop a like if you like this video, and subscribe if you loved it. Thanks.
Stay sciencey!